Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we dig into a topic, we are looking at a specific event, a moment in time.
A single point on a map.
Exactly, a
Yeah.
scientific breakthrough, maybe a specific election or a corporate collapse.
Okay.
But today, today feels different.
Uh-huh.
Looking at this massive stack of research you've pulled together, the psychological profiles, the economic spreadsheets, the diplomatic cables, it doesn't look like an event. It looks like a 60-year suicide note.
That is a grim but incredibly accurate way to put it.
accept.
We're looking at the Russian Revolution of 1917. Yes, that is the headline.
Right.
But if you only look at 1917, if you only look at Lenin, standing on a tank or the storming of the Winter Palace, you miss the actual story.
You missed the why.
You miss the why. The story we are covering today is the slow-motion train wreck that I think made 1917 all but inevitable.
So we're talking about the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. And the mission for this deep dive is to figure out why it collapsed. And the sources are pretty clear that you can't just blame the last guy in charge.
No, absolutely not. You have to look at the ghosts of the past.
Specifically, the grandfather, the father, and the son. Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II.
Exactly. It's a multi-generational tragedy, really. To understand why the empire fell, we have to look at how their conflicting styles of ruling, swinging wildly from reform to repression and back again, created a pressure cooker that no one could put a lid on.
And we have some fascinating sources to help us do that. We've got personal letters detailing the Tsar's private fears, which it really humanizes them in a tragic way.
It does. They weren't monsters. They were men out of their depth.
And then we have the economic statistics from the industrialization period, which are surprisingly dramatic, by the way, and the on-the-ground reports from the chaos of the First World War.
It really covers the whole spectrum, from the, the gilded palaces to the freezing trenches and the factory floors.
I want to start with a quote I found in the briefing material. This is from Alexander II, the grandfather. This is way back in the mid-19th century. He tells the nobility, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below."
That is the defining quote of the entire era. It sends a shiver down your spine because he was right.
He saw the train coming.
He did. And that's the irony we're going to keep coming back to. The regime knew it was in trouble. They weren't blind.
He saw the cracks.
They saw the cracks. They tried to fix it. But as we'll see, sometimes trying to fix a broken, archaic system is actually more dangerous than leaving it alone.
So let's set the stage. Let's go to section 1 of our outline, the grandfather's dilemma. The year is 1855. Alexander II takes the throne. What does the Russian Empire look like at this moment? Because it's not like Western Europe, is it?
Oh, not even close. To put it bluntly, it's a dinosaur.
A dinosaur.
While Britain and France are building railways and factories and, debating in parliaments, Russia is frozen in the Middle Ages. It is an autocracy, meaning the Tsar has absolute power, supposedly given by God. But the most shocking stat from the data is the population breakdown.
Right.
90% of the population are serfs.
90%. That is 53 million people.
53 million. Let that number sink in. And we need to be very clear about what serf means here. We aren't just talking about poor farmers or, tenants.
No.
We are talking about human chattel.
The notes mentioned they could be sold apart from their families.
Yes. While there were laws that tried to curb the worst excesses, in practice, they were property. They were subject to corporal punishment. Whipping was just standard for minor offenses.
Unbelievable.
The women were subject to sexual exploitation by the landowners. They couldn't marry without permission. They were tied to the land. If the land was sold, they were sold with it, like livestock.
It's just so hard to wrap your head around that existing in the same era as the telegraph and the steam engine.
It was completely anachronistic. And when Alexander II comes to power, he realizes this isn't just a moral stain, though there were moral arguments. It was an existential threat to the state itself.
Yeah.
The sources highlight two main pressures here, economic and military.
Let's break those down. The economic argument seems counterintuitive at first glance. You'd think free labor slavery essentially would be profitable for the landowners.
Yeah.
Why was it a problem?
You would think that, right? Because you weren't paying wages. But the data shows the opposite. Serfdom creates zero incentive.
Of course.
If you are a serf, why would you work harder? You don't own the crop. You don't own the land. So productivity was abysmal.
So the output is just rock bottom.
Rock bottom. The nobles were actually falling into massive amounts of debt because their estates were so inefficient, they simply couldn't compete with the modernizing agriculture in the West.
So the system was bankrupting the very people it was supposed to benefit.
Precisely. And it stifled the entire economy. You can't industrialize if 90% of your population can't move to a city to work in a factory because they are legally tied to a village.
Right, no labor mobility.
And you can't have a consumer economy if 90% of your people have zero money. It's a dead end.
And then there's the military pressure.
That's the immediate spark. The Crimean War had just ended in 1856, and Russia lost. Badly.
Humiliating.
It was a total humiliation. They realized their army was backward compared to the British and French. But here's the catch-22. To have a modern army, you need a reserve system where you train men for a few years, send them home, and call them back if there's a war.
Like the modern National Guard or reserve system in most countries today.
Exactly. But you cannot do that with serfs. You cannot take a man, train him to use a rifle, teach him military tactics, give him a sense of discipline and organization, and then send him back to his village to be whipped by his landlord.
He'll use the rifle on the landlord.
Exactly. It's a recipe for armed insurrection. So Alexander II looks at the map and realizes if we want to remain a great power, if we want a modern army and a modern economy, serfdom has to go.
So we get the Emancipation Edict of 1861, the Liberator Czar. On paper, this looks like the greatest human rights victory of the century. 53 million people freed.
It should have been.
But looking at the details,
Yeah.
It seems like a classic case of read the fine print.
It is the ultimate anticlimax. The source material breaks down exactly why it failed to solve the problem. First, just the language of the edict itself.
Okay.
It wasn't written by a reformer, it was written by a reactionary bishop, a guy named Philarès. The text was so dense, so legalistic, that the peasants literally couldn't understand it.
They couldn't read it.
Well, most couldn't read, but even when it was read aloud, it was just incomprehensible. They stood in the village squares listening to it and thought the landlords were lying to them about what it said. They thought the real edict had been hidden.
But the real poison pill was the economics, the redemption payments.
This is the key. This is the economic detail that haunts the next 50 years. The state didn't just give the peasants the land.
They wouldn't just take it from the nobles.
No, they weren't going to confiscate property from the nobility. So the state paid the nobles for the land and then charged the peasants for it. It was a mortgage.
A mortgage they didn't ask for.
A mortgage for 49 years with 6% interest.
49 years, that's 2 generations.
It meant that a serf born in 1861 would be an old man before he actually owned his farm. His grandchildren would be paying off his freedom.
And that's not even the worst of it, is it? The land they got.
No. The kicker was that the nobles, who controlled the local committees drawing up the maps, kept the best fertile land for themselves. The meadows, the pastures. They gave the peasants the swampy, rocky strips. The leftovers.
So the peasants are free, but they are farming worse land than before, and they are drowning in debt to pay for it.
And they still weren't free to move. They were tied to the village commune. The commune was collectively responsible for the debt.
Ah, so a collective debt.
Yes. So the village elders wouldn't let young men leave to go to the cities because then who would pay their share of the debt? It just traded one kind of bondage for another.
So it satisfied nobody.
Nobody. The peasants felt cheated. They had this deep belief that the land belonged to those who worked it by God's law. They called this the Great Lie. The nobles were furious because they lost their status, their free labor, and they felt the compensation wasn't enough. It was a lose-lose solution.
And this leads to what the psychologists in our source pile call the crisis of rising expectations.
This is a concept everyone should understand. Revolutions rarely happen when people are totally crushed and have no hope.
Right.
They happen when things start to get better, but not fast enough. Alexander II opened the door just a crack. The liberals looked through and said, we want a parliament, we want a constitution, we want free press.
And the conservatives.
The conservatives looked at it and said, close the door, you're letting the draft in. He was attacked from both sides.
And that tension turns into violence. We see the rise of these revolutionary groups like the People's Will, and it gets personal for the Tsar.
Very personal.
Yeah.
In 1866, a student named Dmitry Kurokazov tries to shoot him right in the summer garden in St. Petersburg.
Wow.
Alexander survives, but it changes him. The liberator gets scared. He starts to believe the conservatives. He replaces his liberal ministers with hardliners. He tightens censorship. But he can't put the genie back in the bottle. The revolutionary movement just grows.
And in 1881, they finally get him.
March 1st, 1881. They bomb his carriage in St. Petersburg. He crawls out of the wreckage, legs shattered, bleeding to death in the snow.
And this is the pivotal moment, because standing there, watching his father bleed to death, is his son, Alexander III.
Imagine the psychological impact of that. You are the heir. You just watched your father, who tried to be the good guy, who freed the serfs, who was actually carrying a draft for a limited constitution in his pocket that very day.
No way.
It's true, he was about to sign it, and he gets murdered for his trouble. What lesson do you learn from that?
You learn that reform is suicide.
Exactly. You learn that if you give the people an inch, they will take a mile and they'll kill you. So you decide to give them nothing. You decide to clamp down.
Enter Alexander III, Section 2. The pendulum swings back.
Ah.
This guy is, well, he's a character.
He is a bear of a man, physically imposing, famously strong. The stories say he could bend iron pokers with his hands and crush silver rubles with his fingers.
Wow.
And intellectually, he was rigid. He wasn't even supposed to be czar. His older brother died, so he was underprepared. But he had a very specific mentor, a man named Konstantin Pobedonoscev.
I saw that name all over the notes. He seems to be the shadow hovering over the end of the dynasty.
Pobedonoscev is the Grand Inquisitor figure. He was the tutor to both Alexander III and his son Nicholas. His philosophy was simple. Democracy is a lie. Parliaments are talking shops. The press is the enemy.
A real charmer.
He believed Russia was unique, too big, too wild, too cold to be governed by anything other than an iron fist. He taught them that autocracy wasn't just a political system, it was a religious duty, a sacred trust from God.
And Alexander III swallowed that whole. In 1881, right after the assassination, he releases the Manifesto of Unshakable Autocracy.
The title tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? Unshakable. He basically told the country, the era of reforms is over. We are going back to basics: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality.
So let's look at the machinery of this repression. How did he enforce unshakable autocracy on a country that size?
Well, first, he built a police state. This is when the Okhrana, the secret police, really becomes the terrifying network we associate with Russia. They infiltrated universities, factories, the army. They had files on everyone.
So a culture of fear.
A deep culture of fear. You couldn't speak freely in a tavern without wondering if the guy next to you was an informant.
And he went after local governments, too. The Zemstva.
Right. The Zemstva were these local elected councils. Alexander II had set up to manage things like roads, schools, hospitals. They were the one tiny seed of democracy in Russia.
And Alexander III hated them.
He saw them as a threat, so he created a new position, the land captain. These were nobles appointed by the Tsar who could overrule the elected councils, fire the teachers, and even overturn local court verdicts.
So he systematically dismantled the few civil institutions that existed.
He refeudalized the countryside. It was a deliberate turning back of the clock. But he didn't stop there. He went after the culture. This is the policy of Russification.
Which is wild when you realize that the Russian Empire was barely half Russian.
Barely. It was a vast collection of Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, Georgians, Muslims, Jews, Baltic Germans. Russification meant banning local languages in schools. It meant forcing people to convert to the Orthodox Church. If you were Polish, you couldn't learn in Polish. If you were Finnish, your local autonomy was stripped away.
And darkest of all, this is where state-sanctioned anti-Semitism becomes official policy.
The pogroms, yes. Violent mob attacks on Jewish communities, often ignored or even encouraged by the local police, and the May laws, which restricted where Jewish people could live, cramming them into the Pale of Settlement. Alexander III needed a scapegoat for the country's problems, and he chose the Jews. It drove massive emigration to America, by the way.
Here's the tricky part, though. Looking at the timeline, it kind of worked. In the short term.
That's the dangerous lesson, isn't it? It did work, in a way. Alexander III brought stability. He avoided major wars for 13 years. He died in his bed. There were no major revolutions during his reign. The terrorists were hanged or exiled to Siberia. Russia was stable.
But the expert analysis here uses a great metaphor. It says he bottled up the pressure without creating any safety valve.
He sat on the boiling pot, he strengthened the autocracy, but he didn't solve any of the underlying problems, the land hunger, the poverty, the lack of rights. He just suppressed the symptoms with brute force.
And the problem with sitting on a boiling pot
is that eventually you have to get up. And when he died, young kidney disease at 49 in 1894, he handed that boiling pot to a son who was completely incapable of holding the lid down.
Section 3. The weak link. Nicholas II.
Ah, Nicholas. It is a tragedy of casting. If Nicholas had been a British constitutional monarch or a country gentleman, he would have been fine. He was, by all accounts, a nice guy, a devoted father and husband, loved photography, loved cars.
But he wasn't a country gentleman.
No. He was the absolute ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's surface.
There's a quote from him right after his father dies. He's crying to his cousin. He says, "I am not prepared to be a czar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling. I have no idea of even how to talk to the ministers."
It's heartbreaking, isn't it? He was terrified. But, and this is his fatal flaw, he was ideologically possessed. He worshipped his father.
Our bear of a man.
Yes. He kept Pobydonosov as his advisor. He believed that it was his religious duty to maintain autocracy exactly as his father had. He thought any move toward democracy was a sin against God and a betrayal of his father's memory.
So he has the ideology of a tyrant, but the personality of a pushover.
The worst possible combination. He was stubborn when he should have been flexible, and weak when he should have been strong. And to make matters worse, the world wasn't waiting for him to figure it out. The industrial age had arrived in Russia with a vengeance.
We need to talk about Sergei Witt. He seems like the one competent guy in the room during this period.
Witt is the technocrat. He's the Minister of Finance. He looks at the West, at Germany, Britain, the US, and he tells the Tsar in no uncertain terms, if we don't industrialize, they will crush us. We are 50 years behind.
So he launches the Witt system. This is the 1890s. What did that look like?
It was crash course industrialization, state-led. He put Russia on the gold standard to stabilize the ruble and attract foreign investment. He went to France and borrowed billions of francs. He used that money to build railways. The Trans-Siberian Railway is his baby. And to subsidize heavy industry. Steel, coal, iron.
And looking at the spreadsheets, the growth is insane. 8% annual growth in the 1890s. That's like China in the 2000s numbers.
It was an economic miracle on paper. Russia became the 4th largest producer of steel and iron. Coal production skyrocketed. But, and there's always a but in Russian history, who paid for it?
The peasants again.
Always the peasants. To pay back those French loans, Witt had to export grain. He taxed the peasantry into the ground and forced them to sell their grain for export, even when there was famine at home.
Wait, they were exporting food during a famine.
Yes. Witt famously said, "We shall not eat, but we shall export."
That is a chilling slogan. It really shows how the state viewed the people as fuel, not as citizens.
Absolutely. They were a resource to be squeezed. And there was another side effect Witt didn't anticipate. By building all these giant factories, Witt created a new class of people in Russia, the urban proletariat.
Industrial workers.
Yes. Sudden, massive urbanization. You have thousands of peasants ripping up their roots and moving to St. Petersburg and Moscow. They are living in filthy, overcrowded barracks, working 14-hour days in incredibly dangerous conditions.
For low pay.
Terrible pay. They are disconnected from their villages, and they are angry.
You are literally assembling the army that will overthrow you. You're building the barracks for them.
Exactly. In the countryside, peasants are scattered across vast distances. It's hard for them to organize. But in a factory complex like the Putilov Iron Works with 12,000 workers, they can organize. They can strike. They can talk to radical students who are handing out pamphlets about Marxism. Witt built the engine of Russia's power, but he also built the engine of its destruction.
And that engine backfires in 1905, Section 4, the dress rehearsal.
1905 is fascinating because it's almost exactly the same script as 1917, but the ending is different. It's the moment where the regime almost collapses but manages to pull back from the brink.
So what triggered it? What was the spark this time?
A stupid war. A completely unnecessary war. The Russo-Japanese War. Right.
Nicholas and his ministers thought a short, victorious war would boost patriotism and stop the domestic unrest. They looked at Japan and thought, we are a European giant, they're a small Asian island nation, this will be easy.
Racism played a huge part in that underestimation, from what I've read.
Huge, they called them monkeys. But instead, Russia got thrashed. The Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. It was a global humiliation. It shattered the illusion of the Tsar's power and competence. If the Tsar can't even win a war against a small country, what is he good for?
And then, that humiliation at abroad meets starvation at home, and you get Bloody Sunday.
January 1905. This is the moment the emotional bond breaks forever. A massive crowd of workers, led by a priest named Father Gapon, marches to the Winter Palace.
And they weren't revolutionaries, were they?
Not at all. They aren't carrying guns. They are carrying religious icons and pictures of the Tsar. They're saying, God save the Tsar. They just want to present a petition for better working conditions and an 8-hour day.
They still viewed him as the little father. They did. They thought, the Tsar is good. It's his bad officials who are hurting us. If the little father only knew how we were suffering, he would help.
And instead,
The soldiers opened fire. Cossacks charged with sabers. Hundreds died, women, children. The snow turned red. And in that moment, the little father died. Nicholas became Nicholas the Bloody.
And the country explodes. The notes say strikes went from about 17,000 participants in a year to nearly 3 million in 1905 alone.
The whole country went on strike. The trains stopped, the telegraph stopped, doctors refused to treat patients. It was a general strike on a scale the world had never seen. And we see the birth of a new organization, the Soviet.
We hear that word a lot, Soviet Union. But what actually was a Soviet in 1905?
The word just means council. It was a committee of workers elected from the factories in St. Petersburg to coordinate the strike. But because the government was paralyzed, the St. Petersburg Soviet started acting like a government.
Yeah, shadow government.
Exactly. They distributed food, they organized militias, they printed newspapers. It was grassroots democracy popping up in the vacuum of power.
So how did Nicholas survive this? The country is paralyzed, the people are furious. Why didn't the revolution happen in 1905?
He survived because he did two things. First, he lied, or at least he bluffed. He was forced by Witt to issue the October Manifesto.
What did it promise?
It promised a Duma, a parliament, it promised civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, everything the liberals wanted.
And this worked.
It split the opposition. That's the key. The liberals, the doctors, lawyers, the middle class, they read the manifesto and said, we won. We have a constitutional monarchy like England. Let's stop the revolution. They called off their strikes.
Leaving the radicals and the workers isolated.
Exactly. And once the opposition was split, Nicholas used the second tool, brute force. The army remained loyal. That's the crucial difference with 1917. The troops returned from the war in Japan, and Nicholas used them to crush the Soviets. He arrested the leaders, including a young Leon Trotsky. He sent out punitive expeditions to burn rebellious villages.
So he buys himself a decade, but he wastes it.
Completely wastes it. As soon as the panic passed, he clawed back all the power he'd promised to give away. He issued the fundamental laws in 1906, which said, oh, by the way, I can dissolve the Duma whenever I want, and I still have veto power over everything.
And he used that power.
Oh, yeah. The first two Dumas were too radical, dissolved. He then rigged the election laws so that one landowner's vote was worth hundreds of peasant votes. He basically turned the parliament into a rubber stamp.
We should mention Pyotr Stolypin here. He becomes prime minister. He seems like a carrot and stick guy.
He was the last capable statesman of the empire, a truly formidable figure. He saw that the current path led to ruin. The stick was brutal. He set up field courts-martial that executed thousands of revolutionaries. The hangman's noose became known as Stolypin's necktie.
But the carrot was smart.
The carrot was agrarian reform. He tried to finally fix the peasant issue. He wanted to let peasants leave the commune and own their own private farms. He wanted to create a class of wealthy, conservative farmers.
A wager on the strong.
Exactly. He thought if peasants were property owners, they wouldn't want a revolution because they'd have something to lose. He famously said, give me 20 years of peace and you will not recognize Russia.
But he didn't get 20 years.
No. He was assassinated in 1911 at the Opera House in Kyiv. And 3 years later, the world ended.
Section 5. The Catalyst. World War I.
You can argue whether the Romanovs could have survived without the war. Maybe Stolypin's reforms would have worked eventually. But the war took away the luxury of time. It exposed every single structural weakness we've just discussed.
It starts with this wave of enthusiasm in 1914, right? Flags waving, people cheering the Tsar on the balcony. St. Petersburg is even renamed Petrograd to sound less German.
Yes, a brief moment of national unity. It lasted about 6 months.
Then the wheels come off fast.
Incredibly fast. Russia had a massive army, the Russian steamroller. But it was poorly led and poorly equipped. We talk about the shell crisis of 1915. Russian industry just couldn't produce enough ammo.
I read that soldiers were being sent to the front without rifles.
It's true. They were told to wait for a comrade to die and pick up his gun.
That is just horrific for morale.
And the leadership. A catastrophe. The Battle of Tannenberg, August 1914. The Russian Second Army is encircled and annihilated by the Germans. 300,000 casualties in one battle. It set the tone for the whole war. By 1917, Russia had suffered nearly 4 million casualties. Killed, wounded, or captured. 4 million.
And in the middle of this disaster, Nicholas makes what the historians in our sources all call his fatal mistake.
August 1915. He decides to fire his uncle, the commander-in-chief, who was actually quite competent, and take personal command of the army himself.
Why was that so stupid? He's the Tsar. Isn't that what he's supposed to do?
Well, 2 reasons. One, he was a terrible general. He didn't know how to win a war. But two, and this is more important, symbolically, it was suicide. Before this, if the army lost, he could blame the generals, bad advisors. Now, every dead soldier, every lost battle was personally Nicholas's fault. He tied the fate of the monarchy directly to the fate of the war.
And reason number 3, he left the capital.
He went to the military headquarters at Mogilev, hundreds of miles from Petrograd, which left the day-to-day running of the government in the hands of his wife, Empress Alexandra,
Who's German.
a German princess during a war with Germany. You can imagine the rumors. People were convinced she was a spy, deliberately sabotaging the war effort.
And standing right behind her was her spiritual advisor, the infamous Grigory Rasputin.
The mad monk.
We have to touch on Rasputin. The pop culture version is mystic sex wizard. But politically, what was the actual damage?
The damage was called ministerial leapfrog. Rasputin and Alexandra were deeply paranoid. They felt surrounded by enemies, so they fired anyone who was competent but not loyal enough to Rasputin.
So competence was a liability.
It was. In just over a year, they went through 4 prime ministers, 5 interior ministers, 3 war ministers.
It's a revolving door during a total war.
It meant the government simply ceased to function. There was no continuity. No one knew who was in charge from week to week. The bureaucracy was paralyzed, and this led directly to the collapse of the home front. Food supplies broke down, not because there was no grain, but because the trains were disorganized and no one could fix it. The grain was rotting in the Ukraine while people in Petrograd were starving.
So even the elites, the Tsar's own family, knew this was a disaster.
They did. They begged him to send Alexandra away. He refused. So in December 1916, a group of aristocrats, including Tsar's own cousin, murdered Rasputin. But it was far too little, far too late.
And that brings us to Section 6, the explosion, February 1917.
And just to note for listeners, it's February in the old Russian calendar, which is March in ours. But let's stick to February. It starts with bread.
It wasn't a Bolshevik plot.
No, that is a common misconception. Lenin was in exile in Switzerland. Trotsky was in New York. Stalin was in Siberia. The Bolsheviks were a tiny, marginal party at this point.
So it was spontaneous.
Completely spontaneous. It was International Women's Day. Women who had been waiting in freezing lines for bread that wasn't there, they finally snapped. They started smashing shop windows. Then the metal workers from the Putilov factory came out to join them.
And for a few days, it's just riots. The police are shooting, but the crowds are getting bigger. And then comes the turning point, the army.
This is the difference between 1905 and 1917. In 1905, the army shot the crowd. In February 1917, Nicholas, from his headquarters, orders the Petrograd garrison to shoot the protesters.
And they refuse.
They don't just refuse, they shoot their officers. The Volinsky Regiment mutinies first. And you have to remember who these soldiers were. They weren't professionals. They were young conscripts, peasants in uniform. They looked at the starving women in the streets and saw their own mothers and sisters.
And once the soldiers joined the crowd,
the regime is dead. It took about 3 days for the whole system to collapse.
Nicholas tries to get back to the capital, but his train is stopped by railway workers. And in a railway carriage, totally isolated, his generals come to him and tell him it's over.
On March 2nd, he abdicates. He tries to give the throne to his brother Michael, who takes one look at the situation and says, no thank you. And just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule ends.
But, and this is the part people get confused about, Lenin doesn't take over yet. The Tsar is gone, but who is in charge?
Chaos is in charge. But technically, you get a system the sources call dual power. This is crucial to understand the next 8 months of chaos.
Let's define the two sides.
Okay, on one side, you have the provisional government. These are the old Duma guys. Liberals, aristocrats, men in suits. They meet in the Tauride Palace. They have the formal authority. The Allies recognize them. They hold the keys to the ministries. They want to turn Russia into a normal Western-style liberal democracy.
Right.
But they have no real power because on the other side, in the same building, just down the hall in the Catherine Hall, you have the Petrograd Soviet. The workers and soldiers reformed the council from 1905.
And they have the real power.
They control the telegraph, the railways, and most importantly, the soldiers.
There's a famous order mentioned in the sources, Order Number 1.
A crucial document. The Soviet issued Order Number 1 to all the troops, it said. You only obey the provisional government if their orders do not contradict the orders of the Soviet.
So they gave themselves a veto over the army.
Essentially, yes. It also said soldiers didn't have to salute officers anymore. It democratized and destroyed the army as a fighting force.
So the government has responsibility without power, and the Soviet has power without responsibility.
It's a recipe for paralysis. And caught right in the middle of this mess is Alexander Kerensky.
Section 7. The man who failed. Kerensky.
Kerensky is the tragic hero of 1917, if you can call him that. He was the only guy who was a member of both the government and the Soviet. He was supposed to be the bridge.
He sounds charismatic.
Immensely. A great speaker, very vain, wore a military tunic even though he was a lawyer. For a few months, he was a superstar, the first love of the revolution. He saw himself as the man who would save Russia.
But he makes 3 fatal mistakes.
Massive mistakes. Mistake 1, the war. The people overthrew the Tsar to get peace. But Kerensky and the provisional government felt honor-bound to Britain and France. They relied on Allied loans. They decided to keep fighting the war.
And not just fighting, attacking.
The Kerensky offensive in June, he thought a victory would unite the country. He toured the front giving these passionate speeches. But speeches don't stop bullets. The offensive was a catastrophe. The army just completely collapsed. Soldiers deserted in the thousands. They realized, why die for Kerensky when the Tsar is already gone?
Mistake 2. The land.
The peasants wanted the nobles' estates broken up and given to them immediately. The provisional government said, we are lawyers, we respect property rights, we have to wait for a properly elected constitutional assembly to do this legally. We can't just steal land.
Telling a starving peasant to wait for the legal paperwork seems a little out of touch.
It was political suicide. The peasants just burned the manor houses and took the land anyway, and the soldiers at the front heard about it and deserted in droves to go home and get their share before it was all gone.
And mistake 3. The economy.
They couldn't fix the supply chains. They couldn't get food into the cities. Bread prices rose 500% between February and October. 568 factories closed in Petrograd alone. The revolution hadn't put food on the table.
So people were disillusioned.
They started asking, what was the point of getting rid of the Tsar if we are still hungry and still dying in trenches?
And watching all this from the sidelines, licking his chops, is Vladimir Lenin.
Lenin returns in April. The Germans actually put him on a train, the famous sealed train, and sent him back to Russia like a biological weapon, hoping he would destabilize their enemy. And it worked better than they could have possibly dreamed.
Lenin sees exactly where Kerensky is failing, and he comes up with a slogan that is just marketing genius.
3 words. Simple, brutal. Peace, bread, land.
It's surgical.
It is. It addressed the exact pain points of the population. The government gives you war. I give you peace. The government gives you hunger. I give you bread. The government tells you to wait for land. I give you land now. He didn't promise socialism or the dictatorship of the proletariat to the crowds. He promised them what they needed to survive that day.
And he adds another slogan, all power to the Soviets.
Which was clever. In the spring of 1917, he wasn't saying all power to the Bolsheviks yet. He was saying the provisional government is fake. The Workers' Council should be the only government. And since the Bolsheviks were working tirelessly to take control of the Soviets, it meant the same thing eventually.
There is one final gasp for the government. The Kornilov affair in August.
Briefly, yes. A right-wing general, Kornilov, decides he's had enough of the chaos. He marches his troops on Petrograd to crush the Soviets and hang the socialists. He wants to set up a military dictatorship.
And Kerensky panics.
He has no troops to stop him because the army hates him, so he has to do the one thing he shouldn't have. He asks the Bolsheviks for help.
He arms his own enemies.
He opens the arsenals and gives rifles to the Red Guards, the Bolshevik militia. They stop Kornilov without firing a shot. They just sabotage the train tracks and talk Kornilov's soldiers out of fighting. But now, the Bolsheviks are armed heroes who saved the revolution, and Kerensky looks like a weak fool who had to rely on them. It was the end.
So by October 1917.
The game is over. The army has dissolved. The peasants have seized the land. The cities are starving. The provisional government is a ghost. Power was lying in the street, as Lenin said.
And the Bolsheviks were the only ones organized enough to pick it up.
On October 25th, they stormed the Winter Palace. It wasn't a huge battle, like in the movies. The palace was defended by a few cadets and a women's battalion. The Bolsheviks basically walked in, arrested the ministers, and said, "We are in charge now." And just like that, Russia's brief, chaotic experiment with democracy was over.
Bringing it all back to the beginning, the slow-motion train wreck. When you look at this 60-year arc from the emancipation to the Bolshevik coup, was it inevitable?
Historians hate the word inevitable. But looking at the sources, it is very, very hard to see a path where the Romanovs survive. They wanted to have it both ways.
How so?
They wanted the power of a modern industrial state, the railroads, the factories, the guns, But they wanted to rule like medieval autocrats.
They wanted the hardware of the 20th century with the software of the 16th century.
That is a brilliant way to put it. And the software crashed. The system couldn't process the complexity of modern society. And when the stress test of World War I hit, it didn't just bend, it shattered.
And the tragic irony.
The irony is that the chaos of 1917, the total breakdown of order of the state itself, made people desperate for anyone who could restore control. The provisional government failed because it was too weak, too democratic, too legalistic. It paved the way for a group, the Bolsheviks, who were willing to be even more ruthless, even more centralizing than the czars ever were.
The Red Tsar replaced the White Tsar.
And the pressure cooker was sealed shut once again, perhaps even tighter than before. But that is a story for another deep dive.
Indeed it is. It's a heavy story, but a necessary one to understand the world we live in. To our listeners, think about that final thought. How much does the fear of chaos drive people into the arms of tyranny? Something to mull over. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.